Hey guys, thank you for watching the video. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to my channel Undefined. Today we are going to talk about another interesting topic in Salesforce called Authentication Provider, and we will also briefly touch upon login discovery and its application in Salesforce. So, as you know, Salesforce um, as a whole itself is a complete system, and Salesforce is also capable to provide authentication, which is the username password based authentication to all its user, be it normal Salesforce user or community users. So we have the inbuilt feature in Salesforce where you can simply have a credential like username and password, and you can use login.salesforce.com or test.salesforce.com to log into Salesforce. But sometimes, uh, due to obvious reasons, requirements, we do need to implement certain functionalities where login to Salesforce is not controlled by login, rather by an external third-party application. For example, single sign-on is a type of authentication which is not maintained within Salesforce, rather it is controlled outside Salesforce in Microsoft Active Directory if it's going to be a SAML-based authentication. Similarly, we have other options like delegated authentications. We also have authentication providers where you can set up custom authentication providers like Facebook, LinkedIn, Janrain, GitHub, Apple. Different kinds of setups can be there. And in normal, you must have seen different websites where the web pages allow you to log in and access the resources using the credentials of Facebook, like login as Facebook and login as LinkedIn. And so technically, those setups are called or classified as authentication providers. We also call them as social login many a times, but the technical name would be authentication provider because those services provide authentication to the service provider and itself act as identity provider. Okay, so before we talk about the technical details, let's just take a walkthrough of how it looks like. So this is my org where the authentication provider has already been set up. You can see by default we are getting this authentication provider logo, which is Facebook, because we have used Facebook. So when I click on this button, basically Salesforce is going to redirect my request to a Facebook authorization server. Facebook is going to catch the request, process the request, and if everything goes well, if the authentication is successful, then then we will be allowed to access Salesforce resources and a valid session ID will be established. So let's do that. So if I click on this Facebook, you can see instead of asking the username password of Salesforce, it is instead redirecting me to the Facebook authorization server where I'm going to write down my password for Facebook, and this is my Facebook credential, not Salesforce credential. And you can pay attention to the URL. So once the authentication at the Salesforce end, sorry, once the authentication at the Facebook end is successful, Facebook is going to return a response to Salesforce saying that this user has been authenticated. You should create a valid session ID, and then Salesforce will create a valid session ID and allow us to use Salesforce with a valid session ID. So now I'm inside Salesforce, so you have the basic understanding of how auth providers work. So similarly, we can also set up Twitter, LinkedIn, GitHub, Apple ID based on the requirements and based on the services you have. But more or less, this is the general concept. So to make this happen, the process is quite straightforward with some complications. You need to have something called as auth providers on our Salesforce side. You also need to have an application on the Facebook side. So let's see how it looks like. So if we open the auth provider in Salesforce, yeah, so I have already created one with the name of Facebook, but you can create as many as you want. So when you click on new button, by default you see these options like Apple, Facebook, GitHub, Google, Janrain, LinkedIn. You also have a Microsoft Access Control Service and OpenID Connect. For example, well, if you don't see any option which is present here, It's because I mean, these are the managed provider type. So for example, GitHub, Facebook, Apple, LinkedIn, these are the services, these are the provider types that Salesforce manages themselves. So we don't need to worry about the endpoint URLs or the default scopes. But sometimes we do want to have a custom authentication provider. Then in that case, for example, we can use OpenID Connect. So any third-party application supporting OpenID Connect can be integrated with Salesforce as an auth provider. But in this case, we are simply going to use Facebook. And when you select Facebook, you can see the authorization endpoint URL, token endpoint URL, user info endpoint URL. They are all maintained by Salesforce. You don't need to worry about them. In fact, the default scopes is also maintained by Salesforce. So no need to worry about them. You only need to worry about the consumer key and consumer secret, which you're going to get from the Facebook application that you create. And also we have this registration handler, uh, which is an Apex class. So you can, when you click on this link, automatically create a registration handler template. When you save this setup, one custom class will automatically be created when the setup is complete. And then you have to select who should be the running user for this auth provider. So I don't need to click on save because I already have created one, which is this one. And here you can see that we have the consumer key and consumer secret from Facebook application. Everything else is blank. And the registration handler is this one. We will also take a look on the other side, which is on the Facebook side. And we will also take a look on how this handler works. At the same time, we also have some configuration URLs like this, like single sign-on, existing URL linking, callback URL, single logout URL. We also, if you haven't implemented communities, you can also see community URLs that you need to use to set up to complete the setup. All right, so moving on towards the Facebook side. So let's open developer.facebook.com. So if you are already authenticated within within the Facebook in the Facebook page, you will see an option, this option called My Apps. And in My Apps, you have an option to create an application if you don't have the application already. But I have already created the application. So if I open this one, here we can see that this is the app ID. So basically, let's go to the basic settings. Here you can see the app ID, which is the consumer key, and the app secret, which is the consumer secret. So you copy this value from here and you paste this value in Salesforce connected app. Sorry, Salesforce auth provider. So this value, this is the app ID, which is consumer key, and this is the consumer secret, which is the consumer secret from here, app secret from here. Rest other fields are optional, so you don't need to worry about them. But after this app is created, after you click on save, you need to connect the app to a product. So we are using Facebook login product. So if you go to the settings of this product, you just need to make sure that this option, auth login client, auth login web, and HTTPS enforcement is done. And initially this field is going to be blank. So you need to copy the callback URL from here. This is the callback URL. And then this callback URL will be pasted here in this field. And then finally you click on save. And this completes the whole setup. At least the configuration part is done. Okay, so once this is done, as I said, the registration handler Apex class contains some main logic. So whenever someone tries to log into Salesforce using the Facebook auth provider, this class executes in this user's context. So let's open the class. So this class implements an interface from Salesforce called auth.registrationHandler. So this is the interface, and this interface has two mandatory methods: create user and update user. And these two methods have similar parameters. The return type is void for this one, and return type is user for this one, for create user. And both these methods receive the almost the same parameter, except the fact that update user has additional user ID parameter as well. Auth.user data parameter contains all the data coming on towards Salesforce from Facebook or from the authentication provider. So this method will be called, update method will be called if the user who's trying to log in has already logged in before using the application. So instead of creating the user, Salesforce will automatically invoke the update user method. But if someone is trying to log in for the first time, then obviously create user will be called. So you can write your logic here on how do you identify that under what conditions and circumstances you should create a new user. So you can do that here. But in general, you simply return the instance of user object pre-populated with all the mandatory fields. In this example, we are not doing much, but you can imagine since it's an Apex code, you could have done a lot more in this code. If you had implemented community, then you'll have to use SFDC network ID, which contains the community ID, portal ID. And here in this if loop, if branch, you could have created the account and contact and basically done whatever you want to do based on the requirement. But this is the skeleton of the class, and it works perfectly fine because we are not doing much here. Okay, uh, so now we know how do we do the setup, and we also have seen the Facebook registration handler class. But you have to understand the fact that we are talking about two different parts here. The first part is Salesforce, which contains my user record. But in Facebook, there is also one user record which corresponds to me. So both these user records need to be connected and cross-referenced. It's just like how you would have done for a single sign-on implementation, right? Because in SSO, you have to store the federation ID on the user object, on the user record, and this federation ID comes from the IDB provider. Similarly, you will have to maintain here the connection between the Facebook user and the Salesforce user. And if you already exist as a user, you can use this link called existing user linking URL, and this URL will connect your Salesforce user record to the Facebook user record. Now I'm going to basically open my user record and I can show you where that connection lives. So this is my user record, and if you go to third-party account links, here you can see that my user record is already connected to another user in Facebook with this ID as this auth provider. So if I revoke this for now, that's gone. So now at this point of time, my user record in Salesforce is not cross-referenced to the user record in Facebook. So under that situation, I would have to, before I start using the application provider, authentication provider, I need to make sure that both of my users are connected. So you can see when I do that, it says link your Facebook account. This is my Facebook user ID and this is my Salesforce user ID. So I click on link account and the linkage is done. So now if I go back to this again, we can see again that the third party linking has been established. So this is the cross reference. So whenever we try to log into Salesforce using the Facebook auth provider, first Salesforce is sending a request to Facebook and it is passing this ID. Then Facebook allows you to write down the credentials. If the credentials are correct, you get redirected to Salesforce with the same ID, and then Salesforce identifies the user record which is connected to this ID and then establishes a session as that user record, which is me here, based on the success or failure response from Facebook. So this is how overall works. I could have also created a flow chart, and I'm sorry for that. I think I can do that separately and post it on LinkedIn, or I can probably post it on some other blogging website. I'll do that definitely later, but here you can understand the flow. You can imagine that it starts from Salesforce, it goes to Facebook, the verification happens there, then it comes back to Salesforce. And in the entire transaction, we are using the Facebook user ID as the key here to identify the user in Salesforce. Okay, so this is how it works out as far as auth providers are concerned. Now we will take a look on how the login discovery works and what exactly is a login discovery. Okay, so we are again back to the Salesforce login page. Please note, I'm always using my domain URL when I'm trying to log into Salesforce. I'm not using the login.salesforce.com URL, because login.salesforce.com URL always gives you the username password based authentication. But if you have to use single sign-on, or if you have to use auth provider based service, you always have to use your my domain URL, because the subdomain in your domain actually is the main identifier that Salesforce uses to allow you to either use single sign-on or these auth providers. So always make sure that you're using the domain URL. So you can see by default we have this Facebook option from before. We are not going to use this. We are going to use a login with different account. And here you can see that uh, instead of asking a username password, it is asking me a email. So that's what login discovery does. So login discovery, as the name suggests, is the process where you're trying to discover the login. You may not be always aware of your username and password, or intentionally or unintentionally, it doesn't matter. Sometimes business or different customer wants to implement a feature where the users are not allowed, or sorry, the users are not required to remember the username and password. Instead, they would like to uh, process the login request based on some common or key identifier like email address or phone number. In this case, we're using email address. So login discovery is basically a two-step process, an interview-based process. In the first step, Salesforce asks you an identifier like email address, phone, or it can be anything based on whatever you have set up. And then in the second step, if you identify the identifier, then Salesforce creates a session for you, right? So you can imagine that if I write my email address here and click on login, some process will be invoked in the background, and then that process is going to find my user record with that identifier and then create a new session and then allow the complete login process. Okay, so that's what login discovery does. So in this example, I'm simply going to write my email address. So this is my email address, and when I click on login, pay attention to the URL. It is redirecting me to Facebook for now, because it identified that my user record is already having a valid connection to Facebook. So instead of redirecting me to normal username password based flow, it redirected me to the Facebook flow, because in the priority list we have given the Facebook priority on top. So I will show you the code. So again, I will simply write down my Facebook credential and login, and then I'll return back to the setup page. So at this point of time, you can see the communication is happening between Facebook and Salesforce. Okay, so let's see how was this possible. We have to dig deeper into the class, but before we do that, I can show you how it looks like in Salesforce. So go to my domain, and in my domain, go to edit. By default, the login page type is standard, but you can change this to discovery, and when you do that, it is going to ask what's the login prompt. You remember that the login prompt in our case was email. It's because we are asking for email. If you change this to phone, it will be something else. And then we have this login discovery handler, and this is the main class which is actually identifying the identifier, and then taking it forward either to Facebook or to username and password flow. We will see. And again, we have this executing user, the running user, which is going to be used to run this Apex class. At the same time, we also have the authentication service, which is login form or Facebook here. As of now, both of them are currently being used, so you can either use Facebook or you can use login discovery. If I remove this one, then obviously it will always use login discovery and not directly under the hood. The login discovery will use Facebook at some point of time, but it's not already there from the beginning. So I'll just click on save. Yeah, so if I log out and again, so you can see now the auth provider has gone and there is no username password based, nothing at all. So I'm again simply going to write my email address here and then log in, and then again it is going to identify that this guy was already logged into Salesforce by Facebook, and we have a valid session of Facebook as well in the browser. So something happened, many communications happened between Facebook and Salesforce, and then I was returned back to Salesforce UI with a valid session. Let's move and let's take a look on the Apex class, which this is the main core logic which is handling this whole process. So always remember that the login discovery in Salesforce domain is handled by this interface, which is my domain login discovery handler. And this interface only has one mandatory method called login, which is this one. And this login method by default, it expects an identifier, which in our case is email address, start URL. It can be, you can also provide a starting URL, and the map of the request attributes. Here I'm just verifying the identifier if it's not null, and I know that it's going to be email address. So I find the user based on the email address, and then if it is not empty, I return another method. If it is empty, I return an exception that no user found. So if you try to use an email address which is not present in Salesforce, it is going to block your request, but it could have done anything. Since it's Apex, you could have written a code to create a user on the fly, but here we are simply blocking it. All right, so let's go to this one, discovery result method. Here you can see that based on we have defined certain priority here. We first of all try to find out the URL for third-party link. In this case, it's Facebook. If it is blank, then we see if there is any single sign or implementation. If it is also blank, then we see if it is if we can redirect the user to the username and password based authentication, which is here, auth.session management and finish login discovery method. It redirects you to username and password based authentication. So let's see first this one. So get third party link is this one. So here I'm simply querying this object third party account link, and I'm passing the user ID of the user who is trying to log in based on the identification, and the provider is Facebook. If there is a linkage, then we simply return the SSO URL, which is basically this one, and we get the URL using auth.auth configuration get auth provider SSO URL. We pass null, and Facebook is the name of developer name of the auth provider. And when we get the URL, we simply return the URL, and if this URL is not null, we return a page reference to that URL. All right. Okay, so this is the page ref. So get third party, it returns it gives the URL, and then if this is not null, so let's see what happens if this third party's link is null. What happens if there is no Facebook login already? Then it goes to SSO redirect, right? And here we query the SAML SSL config object, which is the object that stores a single sign-on information. And when I say single sign-on, it literally means this one. Yeah, so this is the SSO. We don't have a real SSO here, but it's a demo SSO which I created to test something else. So if Facebook login is not available, then we query if there is single sign-on implementation for that user. If it's true, then again we return the auth configuration SAML SSO URL. This is a method in the auth configuration class where you have to pass the my domain URL, which is this one, and the SSO ID, which is the ID of this record. Here it comes back. So if the URL is not null, we create a page reference to those URL, and then we redirect the user to that particular URL. If everything is blank, then we simply return the username and password based flow, which is based on auth.login discovery method.password. It's an enumeration which is expected by this particular method. Okay, I would definitely recommend you guys to take a look at this interface. This is the official documentation, and you must go through this to understand more. Okay, so let's do that. Let's do one by one. So we have already seen the example where the identifier was used to redirect me to Facebook. Let's try to tweak that. Let's try to, yeah. So we will simply revoke this. So this is done. And single sign-on setup, as I said here, we don't have a real single sign-on, so that's why SAML is disabled. But if there was a SAML enabled, this would have on the second preference. So first preference is Facebook, second preference is SAML, and third preference is username and password. So here we have removed the Facebook part, and we have also removed the SAML part. So now if we try to log in, it is simply going to use the third preference, which is the username and password, right? So log out again, my email address. Now when I click on login, the class will be invoked, the method will be invoked automatically. It will check if there is a Facebook link. There is no linkage now because we have removed it. Then it will check if the SAML is enabled and if we have a valid single sign-on setup. If yes, it will redirect me ideally to that single sign-on page. But we have disabled that because we don't have the setup now. But the code is working. And the third is, okay, when nothing is available, then the fallback would be to redirect on the standard Salesforce username password based flow. Let's see what happens. Yeah, you can see it goes to standard Salesforce username password based flow. And then we are here. So you can definitely imagine that if there was a single sign-on setup, I would have been redirected to the IDP page instead of Salesforce page. But in this case, the first and second, both of the options were not working. So we were redirected to the third option, which is the fallback option when nothing is working. If I just simply, let's say if I simply connect my user again with Facebook, because I removed the linkage before. Okay, it is done, and then I'm going to try to log in again with my, now at this point of time, instead of moving towards the standard page of username and password based flow, we were redirected to Facebook and then we came back to Salesforce. So you can define the priority, you can make your code as advanced as possible, but the point here is that uh, login discovery is a great way to identify what login flow would be best for you. Should it be username and password based flow? Should it be uh, SSO? Should it be Facebook, LinkedIn? Anything depends on, you can create different attributes on user object, or you can create different configurations, and based on that you can take decisions. Since we are writing Apex here, you can know Apex can do magic, and I'm sure a lot of processes around this can be automated. So I'll try to create some login flows diagram, and I'll try to put that on somewhere, maybe LinkedIn or on a blogging website. And I hope this session was interesting to you. I'll try to, I simply try to do more in my session rather than creating the PowerPoint slides. So I'm more of like a show and tell kind of a guy. So if you think that I should create more slides and more pictures, then please let me know. But I thought that maybe walking you through the code would be the best. Walking you through the code would be the best possible option for me. Anyway, thank you. Take care and have a great day ahead.